Hello, Dr. Simon Ali here again for Rosa Ali Assessment Across the Lifespan. Continuing on with this series of videos, at the last couple of videos we talked about the central nervous system and we talked about the effects of stress on that central nervous system. Today we're going to be talking about the peripheral nervous system. So what is the peripheral nervous system? The peripheral nervous system is that part of the nervous system that comes from the central nervous system. So just a quick recap. Last time we talked about the brain with its various lobes, the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, the temporal lobes, and their various functions. We talked about these two specific regions very briefly in red and in blue. This is the precentral gyrus, which is concerned with motor movements, and this is the post-central gyrus, which is concerned with various somatic sensations, and we'll talk more about that today. And when we opened this brain up, we looked at the mid-sagittal section, and the mid-sagittal section of the brain that contains the brainstem. So there was three regions to the brainstem: the midbrain, the medulla, and the pons, the cerebellum, and then the spinal cord. So the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord constitutes what we call the central nervous system, and then everything that comes into and out from that is the peripheral nervous system, including, and what we don't often think about as part of the peripheral nervous system, are these things that we call the cranial nerves. And there's 12 sets of cranial nerves, and part of the exercise for you to look at is the name and the function of those cranial nerves, because some of those cranial nerves are extremely important, because malfunctioning of those cranial nerves can lead to eye problems such as double vision with cranial nerve 3, 4 and 6, and then we've got the fifth cranial nerve, which is the facial nerve, that can lead to things like palsies of sorts. But that's something for you to look at, and I'm sure Rosa's going to pose up a question in relation to that. The other thing that I want to very quickly bring your attention to is that within the brainstem lies this network of fibers we call the reticular formation, and a part of that reticular formation is the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is important because it is a region of the brain that causes increased or decreased activity in the cerebral cortex. That's important for things like alertness, important for concentration. And again, this is important in neuropsychological assessment, but we'll come back to an example of that. But I just want to point out to you that it resides within the brainstem. So let's get back to some basic physiology. The central nervous system, there is the peripheral nervous system, that is everything that comes out and comes into. So everything that comes into from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, we call that part of the division the afferent division of the nervous system. So this is the sensory nervous system, and I'm sorry, that should be an A, afferent. And then everything that comes from the central nervous system out is the efferent. So A for afferent comes in, E for efferent, that goes out from the central nervous system as the peripheral nervous system. So an example of that would be the motor nerves that control skeletal muscle movements. The peripheral nervous system has further divisions, and the peripheral nervous system has divisions, first of all, called the somatic and the autonomic. The somatic division of the peripheral nervous system is that division that controls our skeletal muscles, and that is all that it does. It controls voluntary skeletal muscle movement, as opposed to the autonomic nervous system here. And the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary part of our nervous system, and it controls smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is the muscle that surrounds your tubes of the body, such as your blood vessels, so it's important for blood pressure regulation, as well as the gastrointestinal tract, so gut movements, for example. The autonomic or the involuntary is also important for control of cardiac function. So your heart muscle is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system can be further divided into what we call the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And essentially the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system can be thought of that which activates things. So it increases the activity of muscle, it increases the activity of secretory glands. The parasympathetic division does the opposite. So they work in opposing one another, so that when the sympathetic is up, the parasympathetic activity is down, and vice versa. You rarely have where the two are activated together. There are conditions where, or there are circumstances where that happens, but it's rare. The autonomic nervous system also gives rise to what we call the enteric nervous system, and this is the nervous system that's associated with the whole of the gastrointestinal tract. So it's involved with movement, peristaltic movement of the gastrointestinal tract that moves food from the start of your tube all the way to the end of your tube, which is your anus. And it's also important for regulating the secretion from various glands associated with the gastrointestinal tract. And of course, I'm not going to go too much into the gastrointestinal tract because that's a whole video on its own, but we know that a proper functioning of the gastrointestinal tract is of extreme importance, and there's a lot of research output at the moment that relates to gastrointestinal tract function, and particularly the microbiota of the gastrointestinal tract and how that can affect your whole hormonal system, and it can affect your central nervous system and therefore affect various behaviours. And as I said, there's a whole lot of research, particularly psychological research, that is being conducted in this area at the moment. Very, very hot topic, but we're going to come back and talk a lot more about that. So the peripheral nervous system is a part of your nervous system that has a number of functionalities. And I'm going to talk first of all about the lower order function of the peripheral nervous system in spinal reflexes. So what are spinal reflexes? A spinal reflex is something that happens quite rapidly and automatically, not autonomically, but automatically without you having even to think about it. So think of an instance where you may have put your hand accidentally on a hot stove and you withdraw that. Think of an instance where you may have stepped on a tack and you withdraw your leg from that tack. So that's called a withdrawal reflex. It's something that happens without you even have to think about it because it occurs only at the level of the spine. Sensory receptors on the skin are activated, which send impulses to the spine, which then send impulses directly back to the muscle to cause those reflexes to occur. And spinal reflexes are extremely important because not only are they a safety mechanism for the body, but they're also important in balance. The fact that I'm standing upright is a result of thousands upon thousands of spinal reflexes that are going on. So these are not withdrawal reflexes, they're much more minor than that, but nonetheless, they're a result of spinal reflexes that are constantly occurring in my body to keep me balanced. And of course, balance and coordination is extremely important in the field of neuropsychological assessment as well. But I want to talk more about this sensory nervous system, or this afferent nervous system. Let's think of a situation where we might be touching our skin, and touching our skin obviously allows my brain to process that as some sort of an information that's coming from that skin. So what am I doing by touching the skin? I'm activating various receptors, touch, pressure receptors that are located just under the skin, which is sending electrical information to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, I send electrical information up the spinal cord to the brainstem. And if you remember from the video number 1, we have a region called the thalamus. And right here we can see in the brainstem, right here we can see the thalamus. And from that thalamus, we have information that travels to the postcentral gyrus, which is this blue region here. Now, depending on where the information arises, whether it arises from my wrist, from my shoulder, from my leg, lower leg, from my back, from my face, it doesn't matter. Regardless of where that information arises from, it will all travel to the spinal cord, eventually end up in the thalamus, and from the thalamus to a specific region of that postcentral gyrus. So on my left side, it will end up on my right brain, and vice versa. And depending on where the signal arises from, it'll end up in a different place in the postcentral gyrus. From the postcentral gyrus, information is sent to the parietal lobes, to the frontal lobes, where we make some sense of what that information may be. So the primary sensation which comes to the postcentral gyrus simply tells us that there's some signal of some intensity that is traveling to a specific region that places or locates where that signal is coming from. How we relate that signal is the storm of electrical activity that happens in the central nervous system that makes some sense of that information. Is it dangerous? Is it not dangerous? Is it harm to self? Is it not harm to self? So that's in a sort of simplified way how the central nervous system relates to that peripheral nervous system. So all of these sensations that arise from the skin are called somatic sensations. Not only do we have sensations that can arise from the skin, but we can have sensations that arrive, sensory input from the viscera, from the organ system. We also have sensory input from the muscles themselves. How do I know which muscle is contracting and to what degree? Well, obviously it's got to send up some sort of a sensory input to this postcentral gyrus for me so that I have some feeling of what's happening in my body. But I want to bring back now this concept of the reticular activating system that resides within the brainstem. And the reticular activating system that resides within the brainstem can be easily turned on, can be easily turned off by chemicals, or they can undergo natural increases and decreases in activity as would happen during the day and during the night. The reticular activating system that resides somewhere in that brainstem sends electrical signals, so nerve fibers that sends electrical signals to all parts of the brain. And the function of those electrical signals that it sends to all parts of the brain is to increase or to decrease the electrical activity of that cerebral cortex or of that brain. In other words, it's like a dimmer, a light dimmer. You can increase the lights, you can decrease the lights, and you can turn the lights off. So that's the function of that reticular activating system that resides in the brainstem, to increase or decrease the electrical activity, or it acts as the dimmer that turns the lights on or turns the lights off, or gives us different intensity of lights. So why am I telling you about this in relation to somatic sensation? I'm telling you this in relation to somatic sensations because every time we have a signal that travels as a somatic sensation, some sort of an ache from a finger, for example. Every time you have a signal that travels up, it also sends a signal to the reticular activating system to keep it turned on. Now think of a toothache, how difficult it is for you to fall asleep. And of course, for you to fall asleep, you've got to turn the reticular activating system down, which turns the brain activity down, and eventually you fall asleep. So that's your level of arousal that decreases if you fall asleep. If you have a toothache coming in from the fifth cranial nerve, what's going to happen to that level of activity? The fifth cranial nerve feeds directly into the reticular activating system, to the thalamus, and then to the brain. If you've got continual signals, the toothache that's coming in, it continually keeps turning the reticular activating system up, which keeps the lights on, and it's very, very difficult for you to fall asleep as a result of that. So, reticular activating system can lead to alertness, can lead to changes in alertness and changes in concentration. So it's not too big a leap of faith to then think about how things like anesthetics work. I'm talking about general anesthetics, and I think you would agree with me that general anesthetics work on that reticular activating system. In fact, general anesthetics bind to receptors within the reticular activating system and turn it off. By doing so, the lights in the central nervous system are off. Now, why do you have general anesthetics? If you're undergoing surgery, for example, let's say you're undergoing surgery where someone needs to cut your arm or cut through your skin in your belly, for example. It doesn't mean that when someone cuts you, they're not generating sensory signals that's traveling to the spinal cord, from there traveling up the spinal cord, brainstem, to the thalamus and to the brain. That's still happening, and it's still happening very, very rapidly and happening lots. Why is it that we can be lying on the surgeon's table, someone cutting into us, and we don't feel a thing? Well, we don't feel a thing because the reticular activating system has turned the brain off. If the brain is turned off, the signals that are traveling to the post-central gyrus are still getting there, but there's no post-activity to place what those signals are. So we actually don't feel that those signals are there at all because the brain is turned off, the lights are turned off. The same thing happens when you're asleep. When you're asleep, the lights are turned off. If someone comes along and puts a pin in you, do you feel it? Well, you'll certainly wake up if the pin goes in deep enough and it stays there long enough to generate painful stimuli that keep traveling up the brainstem. But if someone puts a pin in, withdraws it very, very quickly, you won't even feel it. And if you do wake up, you feel it afterwards. You feel the pain afterwards. You're not waking up because of the pain. The only reason why you wake up is that the signals that are traveling up the brainstem activate the reticular activating system, which then turns the brain on. You wake up and then you go, oh, why did I wake up? Oh, there's a bit of pain coming up from my arm. Oh, I wonder why that happened. And it's the same at 4, 5 o'clock in the morning when you hear the rubbish truck collecting your rubbish. And in the old days when there were tins of rubbish with the bins would, make all sorts of noises. You'd wake up, but you wouldn't hear that noise anymore because it had come and gone, but it was enough to wake you up and you go, oh, why did I wake up? Despite the fact that all the signals ended up in the brain, but the brain was turned off so it didn't hear anything. Now, why is anaesthetic important? Why are we talking about general anaesthetics? Well, we're talking about general anaesthetics because one of the problems that can occur with general anaesthetics is brain injury, and anoxic brain injury and hypoxic brain injuries. And again, you'll have questions on these that you'll have to explore a little bit further on. So I just want to leave it there, but before I do so, a quick recap of the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and of course what you guys do a lot of is central nervous system processing and the assessment of that central nervous system processing, but we also have peripheral nervous system that we have to take into consideration, largely because peripheral nervous system malfunctionings can lead to apraxias, constructional, idiomotor, idiotonal apraxias, and again we will have some questions that relate to this that you would have to do some further research on in order to answer those. I'm going to leave that video here. The next video will be talking about those electrical signals. So when we talk about electrical signals are generated and they travel, what exactly are they? And through which do they travel? Well, I'll tell you that they travel through nerves, and those electrical signals are called action potentials, but more about that and the importance of those to what you guys are doing next week. Bye.